Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. I am Justin Essery. I'm an Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Wake Forest University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and also sponsored by Springer Publishing. This week's speaker is Nora Webb Williams of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Giving a talk entitled When Republicans See Red but Democrats Feel Blue, Why Labeler Characteristics Matter for Image Analysis. Nora's talk is going to last about 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that's at the bottom of your webinar window. And you can ask a question at any time during the talk, but we're going to hold all questions to the end. If you want to be recognized and ask your question via audio on Zoom, please indicate that in your Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question during the Q&A period. A link to Nora's slides will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you can refer to it throughout the presentation. And now I'd like to welcome Nora Webb Williams to the IMC. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So I am extremely glad to be here. So Justin, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm presenting today on behalf of myself and three co-authors, Andreu Casas, Kevin Aslett, and John Wilkerson. And I should say that this is relatively new work. So I'm very much looking forward to any questions that you have. Feel free to reach out to me after the talk if there's questions we couldn't get to. I'm very much looking forward to your reactions to the presentation today. So I'm going to start with a TLDR summary of the talk today, where TLDR stands for too long, did not read. In this case, maybe it's too long, did not listen, or too much Zoom, didn't pay attention, whatever you want it to stand for. Let me just give you a quick summary in case the internet goes out or you get distracted, as I often do during Zooms. So the first main takeaway point from today is that labeler characteristics affect image annotations, and we could think of that also as being labels. I'll use those two terms interchangeably. So label characteristics, who people are, who your annotators are, might affect your image labels, and that could potentially bias downstream results. So that's the main takeaway from the presentation today. As an example, I'm going to be showing you different annotations from Republican and Democratic, and also male and female identified labelers on a corpus of images that come from Twitter. So these are Twitter images that were shared with left-leaning US-based social movement hashtags. So all left-leaning material on mobilization attempts in the United States. And we have Republican, Democrats, and male-female just using that binary as far as different labeler characteristics looking at these pictures. I'm also going to sneak in a little bit of a discussion of an image clustering method. So this is a methods talk. So there's a little bit of 2 bits of method content here. This is a separate working paper, but we use it in this project. And so I'm going to sneak some of that in, see if you notice it when it comes up. Okay. So the second TLDR summary slide here. So this is the main takeaway figure for the presentation today. And I'll go into much more detail of this, of course, but just as the top line summary here. So this shows 12 emotional reactions that folks might have looking at a picture. So you might look at a picture and feel disgust, sadness, worry, be scared, fearful, have resentment, etc. And what this shows you is across this sample of images from these left-leaning social movements, the differences in the average emotional reactions from Republican and Democratic labelers. So this is the mean, and then a confidence interval, a 95% confidence interval around that mean. So you see that across this whole corpus of Twitter images, we have Republicans reporting slightly higher levels of disgust. In terms of sadness, worry, scared, and fearful, there's not too much of a difference there. In terms of resentment, bitterness, and hate, we're seeing stronger reactions from the Republicans. Anger is mixed. Enthusiasm, pride, and hope, we see it flipping. So the Democrats there reported higher degrees of those emotional reactions to these images. So hence the title of the project. So when Republicans see red or feel resentment, bitterness, and hate, and the Democrats are feeling this different set of emotions. Okay. So let's back up and start with this idea of images in social science research. Images, increasingly vital source of data for social scientists, political science, sociology, etc. Folks are using images as an outcome variable, as a treatment variable, or as a measurement proxy. And many studies use digital images shared on social media, as this one does. But we can also think about images as data as far as satellite imagery, pictures of ballot tallies, militant propaganda visuals, and so many more. So many other examples count as images as a source of data for social scientists. And images as data projects, whether they're big or small, they all rely on human annotations to get a sense of the content of pictures and people's reactions to those pictures. So what's in the photograph or the image, the artwork, whatever it is, and then how people react to that picture. These annotations, which we also call labels, so again, I'll use those interchangeably. We use those for inference and also for training machine learning models. So even if in your images data project, you are not actively engaged in annotating images or hiring someone to do it, but you're relying on an off-the-shelf image analysis tool, perhaps a convolutional neural net or some other model or AI system, even if you're not doing the annotations, that system was trained on human annotations. So it's sort of human annotations all the way down, even if that's not directly what you think is happening in your particular research study. And often we outsource or crowdsource the labeling, particularly for big data projects where you have maybe hundreds or millions of images to look at. We do some outsourcing, we do some crowdsourcing, we have other folks help us in getting those labels. And so the focus of today's talk is on the challenges in that label generating process that come from labeler characteristics. So how we get those human annotations and how that might vary based on who your labelers are. And why do we care? So why do we care about annotations or labels? Well, fundamentally, bad annotations lead to bad inferences and bad machine learning. We're here, by bad, I mean inaccurate or biased or off or somewhat separated from the truth, we can put that in quotes, either the truth that the researcher thinks is there or maybe some sort of idea of there being an objective truth in an image. If you have inaccurate annotations, things that are biased, you're going to make bad inferences, you're going to have bad machine learning. So I think many of us are familiar with this phrase, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have garbage annotations, your conclusions are going to be garbage, bad measurement, bad data. I think the big concern with machine learning in particular, though, is that they can get worse. So it's not just garbage in, garbage out, it's garbage in, dumpster fire out. And there's quite a bit of research that shows that AI systems, machine learning might not just replicate the bias or the inaccuracies of annotations, but might actually make them worse and sort of reproduce them at higher rates. And bad machine learning is not just about the data, not just about the labels, but that's certainly a big part of it. So this is really a driving concern for me in terms of thinking about why do we care about getting good annotations. Okay. So here are some of the challenges. Let's think of the challenges of getting accurate image annotations, where accurate again means unbiased, what the researcher thinks, or some sort of idea of there being a truth, or at least a ground truth that the researcher has deemed such. So some types of image annotation questions seem easier and seem perhaps more objective. So the idea of saying like what's in the picture, that seems fairly objective, and we could even make it simpler, not what's in the picture, but is there a cat in this photograph? Or where in the picture is a cat, if there is one? Okay, so those seem like fairly easy tasks, and easier in the sense of it's faster, it's easier, you're probably more likely to get the correct unbiased answer, or what we think of as the answer that the researcher is looking for or would have given themselves to the question. And yet, even this easy task, okay, so are these image labels ever really objective? So think about tasks like this, which probably you have done as a CAPTCHA to prove to a computer or a website that you are a real person and not a robot. If you've done that, you have engaged in image labeling. You have been an image annotator, and you might be asked to do something like this. Select all the squares with the traffic lights. I would say it's those two, okay? That seems pretty easy. Seems like there's a correct answer there. But what happens if you saw this one? Select all the squares with the traffic lights here. This gets a little trickier. There's a little bit of interpretation that you bring to the question. There's, if it's on the sign, does that count or not? It becomes a little bit more subjective, even the supposedly easy task. And here's another example of this. Throwback to a couple of years ago on the internet, what color is this dress? Do you see this dress as blue and black, which is what I see, or do you see it as gold and white, which many folks see? And so even this question that seems as objective as what color is this can be subject to differences in who the people are that are seeing the pictures and answering those questions that we have. This, of course, gets even more complicated as we start to move to things that we think of more traditionally as being subjective. So things like labeling a picture for the gender of the person in it, or the race, or the ethnicity, even something like age, you start to be in this realm of much more subjective, problematic, potentially labels, where what I see might not be what the person themselves would see or would say about themselves, or we might have disagreements between labelers. So we have this challenge with that. Okay, so I want to propose that we have three broad sources of bias in labels. Okay, so the first place where we might get these differences, variation in labels, comes from varied understanding of the task, where the person doing the labeling maybe isn't entirely sure or doesn't think of the question or the issue the same way that I did when I set up the labeling task. There are fixes for this, okay? So we can have better labeling plans, better schemas, or schemas, however you choose to pronounce that. You could have better pilot forms. Pilot your forms to make sure you're actually clear in what you're asking labelers to do. So for example, if you're having someone do that traffic light task, maybe you have a little footnote that says, by the way, if it's on a sign, you should or shouldn't consider that to be a traffic light, depending on the needs of the researcher and what they've decided is the true and correct response on that particular picture. So we pilot our forms, make sure we have things right. We look at our inter-rater reliability and say, okay, maybe we need to make this more clear, or we need to train our annotators better to make it obvious to them, or more obvious to them, what we want to get out of the images. We can also adjust the labels afterwards. So if we see that there are some labelers that are consistently lower on the scale, they're undervaluing something, we might be able to shift them up. Or we could do something like we could only keep accurate labels of folks who seem to have understood the task. We might have 3 people look at the picture and have a majority rule to decide what the truth is. So we have some fixes for this. We could also have a source of bias that comes from varied innate capability or knowledge or focus. And we have some fixes for this as well, in the literature, the vast literature on doing image labeling. So we can hire experienced or qualified annotators. So if, for example, your project relies heavily on people being able to see that dress or images like that dress as being blue and black, you could put a qualification task. So only folks who see that the way that you think is correct are authorized to then go forward and do a big batch of image labeling for you. We can deal with this issue of focus by putting attention checks. We can also adjust labels, as mentioned before, after the fact to fix for some of these biases, or keep only accurate labels. Now, the third thing is a little bit trickier. So the third source of bias I would think of as varied lenses through which individuals experience, see, read, or understand materials such as images. Okay, so this is to say that people approach pictures with some degree of positionality, and what you see and how you experience it might differ based on your characteristics. This shouldn't be news, or is not news, to social scientists when we think about how many things are socially constructed and where those boundaries are depend on who you are and your position in society. That matters a lot. Or also to cognitive scientists who would say that some people's brains just see things a little bit differently. And that one sort of hints over into that second source of it being an innate capability, perhaps. Okay, but these varied lenses, varied characteristics might be a source of bias. So it could be things like demographics, it could be location, where you are located. As I'm going to talk about today, your partisanship, your ideology, even the era that you're in. Someone looking at a picture 50 years ago might say something very different than looking at it 50 years from now. So all of those things might be a source of bias or different labels to an image analysis project. So we could think of some fixes for this. So we could work with a diverse pool of labelers. We could make sure we get folks from different positionalities to look at the pictures. We can adjust labels based on that. We can also do some adjusting of our models if we're using those labels in downstream analyses to think about Maybe it's not about taking a point estimate and using that in our model, so an average value for what the image is or has, but instead we could model the range of responses to get a sense of there's a big differentiation in how people see these pictures. We need to take that into consideration in our model, not just the average value. So we have some fixes there. But there's another thing that I want to raise here, which is this is not necessarily something that we always have to think about fixing. We could treat this as an opportunity to really understand the differences in labels and why they occur. So why do we have these differences in labels? That's an interesting substantive question in and of itself, not necessarily just a problem that we need to fix. Okay. So I'm going to get into some of these issues about labels and how they differ and how they might affect our analyses and what do we do with that using an example. So we'll have this example project in our minds here. And the driving research question here is, do images matter for the online spread of social movements? And this is a question that's been motivating for our research team for quite a while now. And there seems to be an answer to this question, which is roughly yes. Okay, so images do seem to matter for the online spread of social movements. And we could think about pictures like this, which comes from the Gezi Park protests in Turkey. We see pictures that, for many reasons, garner support for social movements, to help movements spread, get off the ground. So a more interesting and sort of more tricky question besides this, do they matter, is which types of images contribute most to the spread of social movements? And by which types, I mean which image features. What about certain pictures makes them more likely to contribute to the spread of social movements versus others? And we're going to operationalize that here by thinking about which types of social movement images get more retweets on Twitter. Okay, so what, if we think about images, which types of images get more retweets? So this is our example. We could think about this if we're researchers approaching this question, how are we going to answer it? Okay. So in an observational setting, which is where we're at, we would need annotated images to address this which type question. So what type of images? And we want annotations for a number of different things. I'll think about in two broad categories. So the first category is what's in the picture. So I think there's something in the picture that leads to it perhaps getting more retweets. So maybe it's showing a picture of people out on the streets protesting, like that picture of Gezi Park and the woman in red. So maybe it's that it's a picture that contains a street protest that affects the number of retweets it gets. Maybe it's the presence of celebrities or leaders. So someone who is an opinion leader, perhaps a famous politician, that signals to me that I should support or not support this. Maybe there's social symbols like flags or gestures that makes me think that this is a movement that is relevant to me. Or even more on the sort of subjective side of things, there's someone in the picture who looks like me. That might affect whether or not I help it spread by clicking retweet. And then the second set of annotations or labels that we care about in this project are how people react to the picture. So here's where we get to that idea of emotions that are evoked by the picture of that figure that I showed you at the start. So it could matter how people feel when they look at that photograph that affects whether that image helps spread the social movement or not. Or again, is there someone you identify with in the picture? That's a little different than looking like you, but maybe there's someone who evokes a sense of empathy or that you identify with for some reason, and that is what affects what things spread. Okay. So to summarize here, so in this example, to illuminate the issue of annotation issues, the research question here is what types of social movement images get more retweets? So not really going to fully answer that question, but keep in mind that this is our project example. As far as data, which I'll say quite a bit more here in a minute on, we have these left-leaning United States social movements on Twitter. And then we have to think about, so approaching this question, what type of potential annotation variation might we see? So that third issue, what types of labelers might we be concerned about or interested in, okay? And there's two here that I'll focus on today. So the first is partisanship. So we have literature that what party you are in might affect how you react to a picture, Or maybe gender, and again, we're just using the binary here of male, female, might affect what you see or how you respond to pictures. So we think about those as being potential places for annotation variation. Here's some more on the data. So the data, as I mentioned, come from Twitter, from online social movement attempts. So here's how we got this data. From fall of 2017 to summer 2019, we were tracking about 1,200 public affairs organizations on Twitter. We were also tracking national media and politician accounts. And for these accounts, we were gathering every tweet, image, and video. We were also then looking at the hashtags that were used by those accounts, and those hashtags that met a string criteria that we built based on previous mobilization attempt hashtags. So it had to look like a mobilization hashtag. We automatically added those to a stream collector, meaning that we started collecting as many tweets as we could that used those hashtags. And at its peak, we were getting about a million tweets a day based on hashtag use, in addition to every tweet from those groups and media and politician accounts. And what's I think is great and has been really useful about this collection procedure is that we organically started following mobilization hashtags. We didn't have to say, get data on March for Our Lives or Families Belong Together or Believe Women. We automatically began collecting those data, collecting those tweets. So now we have lots and lots of tweets, lots and lots of hashtags. We've winnowed it down into the study. We're studying 11 hashtags. So 11 mobilization attempts. And I'm going to say a little bit about each one of them here. So the first one is Families Belong Together, which was in opposition to the Trump policy of separating families at the southern border. We also have Clean Dream Act Now, Abolish ICE, and No Muslim Ban Ever. And what's interesting about these 4 hashtags is they're all roughly on the immigration issue, whether that's folks coming from the South or people brought to the United States as children looking for dreamer status. They're all roughly in that immigration issue, though slightly different subfields within it. We have Women's Wave, which is mostly opposition to Trump administration around women's issues. We have Unite for Justice and Stop Kavanaugh, which are both in opposition to the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. We have Rise for Climate, about climate change. Write for Rights, which is an interesting one because it's a bit international. It's asking people to write letters in support of political prisoners abroad. We have Say Her Name, which is mostly about memorializing and activism on behalf of Black and Brown women who were killed at the hands of police, a particular focus on trans women. And we also have End Gun Violence, which is a broadly used hashtag to end gun violence, particularly through the use of gun control. So it's very much a gun control hashtag. Okay, so we have these 11 hashtags. We have many, many, many images, many, many tweets. How do we process them? So getting manual labels for all of those images from all of those hashtags from a range of diverse annotators would be extremely costly. So instead, here's where I'm sneaking in this other method. We used an unsupervised clustering pipeline on deduplicated images to group similar images together. So we took all the pictures. First, we automatically deduplicated them and said, well, the pixel values of this one look very similar to that one. We'll just keep one example of that picture. And then we're using what we could roughly call or think of as a visual topic model in quotes for corpus exploration analysis. And what this pipeline does is it takes embeddings from a fine-tuned CNN, the multi-stage k-means algorithm, to cluster similar images together. Again, this is a separate working paper. Happy to address questions or follow up with you after the talk. And once we have these clusters, we randomly select images from each cluster to label, which we can think of as being a stratified random sample, where instead of just taking random pictures from the whole corpus, where we would get the same picture probably over and over again because it's so overrepresented, we've clustered them into similar pictures and taken random images from either of those, okay? So this is a really useful process for highly unbalanced image corpora such as these. So here's a table showing you how much this reduced our labeling tasks. So you can see that even after deduplicating, we had about 650,000 images. And after clustering and selecting, we brought that down to less than 8,000 images that we needed to label. Okay, so how do we label them? We have a Qualtrics survey for each hashtag. We piloted it with graduate and undergraduate students. Each respondent to the survey answers demographic and political opinion questions. They go through an attention check, and then they label 8 images. So each image they label for those 12 evoked emotions. So how strongly they feel those emotions on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all and 10 is the strongest. Humor, This is a binary, which is there humor, anything humorous or not in the picture, anything ironic? Is there a social symbol? Is there a celebrity or leader that you recognize? Is there a street protest? And then again, a level 1 of 0 to 10 of how much do you identify with people in the picture? Okay. We have respondent quotas for Republicans and Democrats and male, female. So it's a strong quota for Republicans, Democrats, meaning that each image is labeled by at least one Republican, at least one Democrat. For male, female, we're not quite as good on that, but we have roughly 50-50 in the entire sample of male and female. Okay, so now we're back to some results. So here's this figure that I showed at the beginning of the differences in mean evoked emotion across all of the images from those hashtags for Republicans and Democrats. So I've talked about this one a little bit more before, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but I do want to note that some of these emotions are fairly similar, so they're on a similar dimension. So for example, worried, scared, and fear, we're going to build an index variable from that we call an anxiety dimension. So it's just the average of these 3 scores, this anxiety index. Similarly with fear, resentment, bitterness, and hate, we're going to treat that as an aversion dimension and build an aversion index. And enthusiasm, pride, and hope, we're going to combine those and take as an index variable for enthusiasm. Okay. So next I'm going to show you the breakdown of these emotional reactions from Republicans and Democrats on the 11 hashtags, okay? So here are anxiety differences by hashtag and partisanship. And what's really interesting here is that it's not uniform. It's not like there's consistently Republicans or Democrats higher on this anxiety. So for rights, the Democrats are feeling higher anxiety. Then we get to No Muslim Ban, Clean Dream Act Now, we see the Republicans reporting higher levels of anxiety. It's interesting too that it's not uniform in this topic of immigration, because on Families Belong Together, it switches and the Democrats are feeling more anxiety. Here's enthusiasm, as I think we probably would expect, given that this is these are left-leaning movements, we get more enthusiasm from Democrats, but not perfectly across the board and not always statistically significantly different. Aversion, here we see some of those interesting patterns of flipping again, where we see Republicans feeling higher aversion on some but not all of the immigration hashtags, but that's not, and also on this climate one, but that's not the same for rights. Sadness, we see some similar patterns of differences. Disgust, we see higher rates from Republicans, but again, not uniformly on Families Belong Together. It's the Democrats that report more disgust. Humor differences, we see some interesting flipping on when someone sees humor. Irony, which is similar but slightly different, arguably, to humor, we see some of those same patterns. Okay. Protest differences. I find this one really interesting. So this is this a picture of a street protest? It's supposedly fairly objective task. And you look at this and it says, well, maybe not. In No Muslim Ban and Abolish ICE, the Republicans are seeing protest more often than the Democrats. So there's debate over what some of these images truly represent. Here's the differences in seeing leaders. So again, some separation, not entirely different though. Same with social symbols. There's some places where Democrats are seeing social symbols more than Republicans, and other places where that flips. And these are the percent of images that had a social symbol. Okay. And also identifying with people who are in the picture. We do see some differences here. Again, this is interesting because I would have expected we would see people, Democrats, having stronger rates of identification with people in the pictures, but that's not uniformly true. All right, so let's talk about the male versus female labels quickly. So we've gone back a step, and instead of showing you across the different hashtags, I'm again showing you across the 12 emotions. And I'm going to breeze through these fairly quickly because in some ways they're not nearly as interesting because the men always are reporting more than the women on these dimensions. This is really kind of curious given the literature, which would have suggested that we would see higher responses from the women than the men. And I've double checked this coding 8 times, and I'll probably check it a couple more times after this just to make sure. But we're consistently seeing the men responding with higher rates of these emotions than the women respondents. And that's consistent across all of the hashtags and across all of the emotions. So here's anxiety differences. Here's the disgust differences. Here's the humor differences. Here's the protest differences. So again, there's differences in when men and women see this thing of a street protest, which we might think is fairly objective. They see leaders at different rates. They identify with people in the photos at different rates. Okay, so let me summarize so far. The clear differences between Republican and Democratic and female and male annotations. And we see variation by the hashtag and perhaps about the content of the social movement as well. Okay, so I'm going to speed up, I promise. Going back to the example research questions, so we could think about how might these differences in annotations affect our ultimate analysis, which is do image types affect retweets? Would labeler differences affect a hypothetical analysis that we're doing to answer that question? So our hypothetical sample analysis here is a set of simple linear models. For data, we're only going to use tweets that have labeled images. So here the comparison is not between a tweet that has an image or not. It's all of these tweets have images. What type of features in those images lead to increases or decreases in retweets? Okay, so the dependent variable here is retweets at least a few days after the tweet was posted. So not immediately, we kind of let things simmer and then we come back and check how many retweets it has. And then the image variables here are those things that I've shown you, the content of the pictures, the reaction to them. And for each model, we're just going to treat each of those image features separately. So we'll have an enthusiasm model or series of enthusiasm models, a series of anxiety models, et cetera. And we have only one control variable here, which is the number of account followers. There's plenty more that in future analyses should and could be added to this, like the time of day affects retweets. Okay. So here's a plot that takes a little bit of explanation. So these are coefficients from these linear models of retweets. So here in the top row, we have all of the models for enthusiasm. So again, the evoked enthusiasm of the picture is the image analysis, is the image variable in this series of regressions. And what each dot shows you is what the estimate of the coefficient for enthusiasm is in that model, based on whose labels we include, right? So if we pool all of them together, we get that orange dot. If we just look at the Democrats, if we just look at the Republican labels, if we just use the female and just use the male labels. Now, usually in a coefficient plot like this, we would see the confidence intervals. I've left those off for a couple of reasons. First, it would make the plot really confusing because there'd be so many of them. And second, none of these are statistically significant at the 0.05 level. So caveat there, I'm not saying that this is the correct model for answering the research question, but the takeaway that I want you to have is look at the coefficient signs flipping. So we would make an assumption that more humor might lead to more retweets if we just had Democratic labelers. But if we just had female labelers, this is kind of curious, if we just had female labelers, we might make a conclusion that instead having more humor in a photograph lowers the number of retweets. And we see that pattern with irony, with leaders, looks similar. Again, the signs of these coefficients flip depending on whose labels you include. Okay, in short, indeed, variation in the pool of annotators does seem to have its potential to impact downstream analyses, sure. So what would I recommend? So again, this idea that it's helpful to have a diverse pool of annotators, at least so you know whether this is happening, and you can look for and adjust your labels or your analysis based on the pattern of variation that you see in the labels. So for this case, for example, instead of having one variable for enthusiasm in our model, maybe we should split this up and say there's a variable for the enthusiasm evoked by the Democrats and a variable for the enthusiasm evoked in the Republicans, and we can model that together. And that would look something like this, where we would have a model that says tweets with images that have more humor are going to probably get more retweets from Democrats. And if you have an image that evokes humor in the Republicans, that's going to be associated with lower retweets in this case. So what's interesting here is that it gets us thinking more broadly about the audience effects here and treating our analysis in a bit more complicated way. Similarly with gender, so we could put in a variable for the emotional reactions or the opinions of the female annotators and the opinions of the male annotators and estimate that simultaneously, which is interesting. Okay. I'm going to wrap up with some future substantive work on differences that comes from thinking through this analysis and doing this type of work. So we could ask what types of clusters and specific images lead to disagreement. This is this interesting question of why is there variation in reactions? So instead of adjusting our models or adjusting our labels, can we understand where this variation comes from? Why is it? So I'm just going to show you a couple examples. I don't have an answer for you on this yet. It's future work. It's going to be really interesting. But here's a snippet from a picture where we had 2 Democrats label this, and both of them said it was protest. 2 Republicans labeled it and said that it wasn't protest. And we could have this be one of those cases that it goes to the PI to make a call on whether it is or not. Or we could show this and we could have a focus group and sit down with people and say, well, why do you think this is protest? Why do you think this is not? Interesting substantive question. Or this one where the Republicans reported higher rates of disgust than the Democrats. And what is it about this picture? Is it an evocation of an Obama slogan or something that leads to higher rates of disgust? There's work to be done here that I think is really, really interesting. Okay. Future substantive work also obviously in terms of answering that research question, which I've shown here as an example to help us think through issues with image labels, but there's obviously hopefully an answer to this substantive question about what types of images lead to more retweets and the spread of social movements. That is future work on our plates. A short answer is it may be more complicated than we originally thought. Andrea and I have this paper from 2018 that looks at the effects of images on retweets, and we didn't really divide up into effects on Republicans and effects on Democrats. And so I think there's interesting work for us to consider there. Okay. Let me just wrap up with the too long didn't read or come back from checking your email. We're back in the Zoom to summary time. Okay. So labeler characteristics appear to affect these image annotations, potentially biasing the results of our downstream analyses. We've shown with our data that we have very different annotations occasionally, not always, but occasionally we have different annotations from Republicans and Democrats and female-male labelers on this corpus of images from Twitter from these left-leaning US-based social movements. And the concern here is that depending on whose annotations you have, you might come to very different conclusions, very different answers to your research question. So I'll end my talk by just saying this is the call for the need to consider annotator characteristics for future image analysis studies, and to many folks do this, but to continue to be rigorous and think about how who our annotators are might affect the analyses that we do. Okay, I'll leave this up here. So thank you for your attention to the talk, and you can reach me by email, Twitter, GitHub. We have NSF support for this project, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Nora, for that presentation. At this point, Nora Webb Williams is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question during the Q&A period. One question has already come in from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for an interesting talk. Sorry to have to point this out, but regression coefficients are not scale invariant, i.e. they are expressed in the unit of the underlying feature. This means that features with different levels of variation will have larger coefficients. Heuristics for more robust or scale invariant metrics would include t-test values for the parameters in the model. So that's not a question, more of a comment, I suppose, but I'd like to know how you respond to that.
Well, I would say that's a helpful comment, anonymous attendee. Not scale invariant. Yes, true. Features with different levels of variation will have larger coefficients. Robuster scale invariant metrics would include t-test various parameters in the model. Yeah, I guess I don't know that I necessarily have an immediate reaction to that, but I think that this is, yes, a correct comment, and one that I will take into consideration in future presentations and future.
So I'm going to piggyback on the question that you were just answering, because I had the same thought. I was thinking you might want to normalize those coefficients by group variation. Essentially, it's just report standardized coefficients. Mm-hmm. That might be feed that into the ML algorithm instead of the raw coefficients. That might, and certainly for your visual comparison, I think that would probably help. And then the same attendee, at least I think the same attendee, sort of elaborated on their question. The labeler characteristic biases and differences portrayed in the presentation are post hoc analyses. Normally, one would adjust the image classification by incorporating these labeler features. The problem here is that machine learning image mining algorithms are unable to directly incorporate labeler characteristics which reflect these biases, sources of variation, or more simply fixed effects. Typically, image algorithms expand an image into a single row of features, each row reflecting a predefined set of pixels in the image. The horizontal data structure does not lend itself to capturing sources of variation such as labeler characteristics. But on the other hand, statistical models like ANOVA, hierarchical models, which actually I was going to suggest a hierarchical model too, are readily able to capture and summarize the relative importance of fixed effects. In a statistical model, one solution would be to incorporate individual labelers as a random effect. Solutions like this aren't possible in image mining algorithms. Again, that's more of a comment than a question, but I'd like to know how you would react to that.
Yeah, so first, just to clarify, when I'm showing those differences in reactions, there's no machine learning happening there. That's just descriptive statistics of how people are responding to them. So I'm not sure if that clarifies that a little bit. And then as far as, so I'm just thinking of this interesting paper that Andreu literally sent to me yesterday, that if this person wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to share it, that actually was talking about ways we could do machine learning models that take into consideration not a point estimate of what the image feature is, but considers the range of responses to the image, and models based on whether or not there is strong agreement between diverse labelers or not, and using that information and not flattening it in the way that we often do. So again, I'm not sure that's entirely an answer to the question, but the thought about hierarchical models is useful, I think, as far as certainly fixed effects seem to be warranted for the different hashtags. That certainly seems to be the case. If you wanted to put in a random effect for different labelers, that's an interesting one. You'd have to have the same people, of course, doing lots and lots of the labeling, where here we only have people looking at 8 images. So there's to fix this, I think, is an interesting challenge. Thank you.
I actually want to ask a sort of an ontological question, which I think is sort of lying underneath a lot of these questions and the general approach. Is it the case that there is a ground truth that an image contains a protest, right? I certainly don't think it's a ground truth that a certain image is disgusting. You can talk to the anthropology department, I suspect, about that, or maybe the psych department.
Right.
But even something that seems a little more objective, like, is this person a leader, is one you mentioned. Does this image contain a protest or a riot, right? Yeah. The first question I have is, do you think there is a ground truth? If so, how do you know? And if not, how can the model, how can your procedure, I wouldn't say your model, but your overall procedure of coding these images account for that?
So first, yes, I think that is the question that I have been wrestling and turning over in my head over and over again. And is there ever anything that's an objective truth? Or are there some things that just are more objective, like whether it contains a protest or not? And so I think I've hedged a little bit on talking about this, about what ground truth is, what the researcher thinks it should be, or how the researcher themselves might answer it. In absence of there being actual ground truth data that we know, for example, someone's identification as far as gender, we could ask them what that is, and presumably that is an actual truth of how they would identify. Getting at it from the image labeling itself is much, much trickier. It's an issue all the way down. Is there any truth? I've become an interpretivist through this process, it turns out. And one of the things I would say is I think this is a a place where image analysis researchers have a lot to learn from qualitative scholars and have a lot of work to do as far as really being clear about whether there is some sort of objective truth, or if every ground truth is just what the researcher thinks truth is in that moment.
I don't think we're going to solve that problem right here, but it strikes me that a more hermeneutic approach to meaning can actually be crystallized in your technique, and it would be just as quantitative as anything else. And what I mean by that is the fact that these definitions are variable and up for grabs, and probably vary according to certain demographic characteristics, situational characteristics, or cultural characteristics, or whatever else. That seems like something we can incorporate into an interpretive model that will then sort of inform, for example, how these images matter, right? So in other words, we can sort of say, in a society where people see things differently, how do these images matter? And I'll leave that work to you because it sounds really hard. But I do.
Interesting. That's how I'll say it. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, your graduate students will have plenty to work on.
There we go.
So one last thing, and this is sort of related. How many people are coding these images in your study?
Good question. So, and I should have that statistic for you right off the top of my head, and I actually don't have it in front of me. If you go, it's about 8,000 images, and each person saw 8 images. Mm-hmm. That's roughly that. We tried to set it up so that you couldn't take the survey more than once. So if we're hoping to have a different set of labelers on each one. It's quite large. It's a lot of people.
If there is a ground truth, in principle, you only need one, right? And then you can maybe correct any biases or something with a model. But if the meaning of the image is up for grabs, that now becomes a focus of a variance you need to capture. And so I'm kind of thinking like, geez, how feasible is it to get what's that old student t-test rule, like 32 people to code every image? That may not even be enough, depending on how many characteristics you want to model. With even you do have a good, even if you have 10 people coding every image, that's a pretty good number, but probably not enough to do what we were just talking about. Right. That's really interesting. Well,
you just end up aggregating. So we could aggregate in some ways, and instead of modeling the image itself, we could model the cluster that it's in. You could have enough people do enough labels for a cluster and say if it's in that cluster, it has these sorts of features. But yes, work to be done. Great point.
We're out of questions. And so what I'm going to do is wrap up the talk. I'd like to thank Nora for her presentation today. I want to remind everyone that the presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share it with a colleague or watch it again later. I hope you will join us on Friday, February 19th. That's next week, when we will host a talk by Zoe Nemerever of the University of California, San Diego, giving a talk entitled Measuring the Rural Continuum in Political Science. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Nora, thank you for being here today.